Welcome everybody, thank you for coming along. The theme for this month's underground philosophy is consciousness, which I changed to the mystery of consciousness because it felt like that could be slightly more stimulating and attractive, but I don't think it necessarily was. It's kind of funny that needing to market or advertise in a time like this about a topic like this, isn't it the most mysterious thing of all? Isn't it, in a way, the most important place to begin understanding from? And yet, well, when it's up against assassination attempts of former US president and maybe riots in the UK, or perhaps topics like free speech, which we might be doing next month, because I think there'll be a little bit of fire about that, and maybe it would be a good idea to be with some fire. Perhaps consciousness, what is it? Is it boring? Is consciousness boring? I don't know. Is it?
Interesting contradiction.
Is consciousness boring? Are we bored of consciousness? There's millions of people in this city. There's millions of people. Is consciousness too boring as a topic? It's shocking how not boring consciousness is. How significant that is. And when I was thinking of people to be in relation to this reality with, it's not really a topic, is it? It's sort of the precondition for our relating to anything at all as we know it. I thought of Cam, and I thought of the many hundreds of hours of conversation we've shared together, and I thought, there's no person here I'd rather be in dialogue with about this, and so it's an honor to be doing this finally. Cam and I have done a number of events together over the years. Remember, we held one in 2019 called Disconnection in the Age of Connection, and I occasionally go back and watch that private video footage with a lot of cringe, and no doubt that will be my experience in another 5 years if I look back at this. But the effort then remains as it is now. The effort was to cultivate a context and to invite a settling in to a reception and a participation, to afford perhaps an opening to feel a bit deeper, to see a bit deeper, to maybe see more clearly. And from that basis, relate to many issues of our time. Relate to the significance of what's present here in relationship. And the topic for this evening is consciousness. So Cam, we could be speaking to lots of different audiences. If this was an academic context only, maybe we'd be wanting to speak about the history of ideas, the history of metaphysics, the way in which consciousness has been both in and out of the picture of educated conversation about reality even. You know, for some, consciousness is something which happens somewhere down the evolutionary line, and it kind of, even if it's not epiphenomenal, meaning that has no effectively meaningful interaction in the context of cosmos, then it just does a little bit here and there, and you can maybe think about it as an emergent phenomenon by virtue of a certain amount of sort of intelligent coordination of biological function, but, you know, whatever, that sits there. And in terms of deeper patterns of reality, what's really true, what's really real, it's kind of a sideshow. And from other perspectives, say an idealist perspective, classically, in academic discourse around consciousness and what mind is and how we ought to think about that, consciousness or mind, and it depends what we mean by these things. So let's just start off very, very broad, but something about the nature of, let's say, subjectivity then, what it is to experience, what it is for things to be like, is fundamental to everything that is. Not just, let's say, on the panpsychist view, where consciousness might be a constitutive part of every, whatever you want to identify as a whole-on or an entity or something like that. And some people are like, well, you're saying rocks are conscious, and okay, no, because that's, maybe the things which make up rocks have some primitive kind of consciousness. And you can see with opening up to this, there's all these different views and ways you can relate to the notion. But the idealist one would just basically say that we're effectively, in the same way that we go to sleep at night and we dream, and everything that happens in the dream you imagine is part of the dream world, in effect, in the context of idealism, everything is happening within the context of consciousness. I mean, consciousness not only just pervades, but the contents of experience that we know as the world, the things that we bump into, take place in that sense inside the notion of, the context of what we mean by mind. So where's the physical in that picture? Well, we say it's a sort of a projection, and maybe we can use the scientific method and we can measure things and we understand how patterns might interact, but it's still taking place within that field of mind. That's kind of that view. And then there's other views which is like, no, it's all fundamentally physical, you reduce it all down, and this mind stuff, it's not really there, it doesn't show up when we measure things, and we can kind of see that when the brain's function stops, then, so does consciousness. And then some people are like, wait, what about near-death experiences? And actually the brain and neurons, it's not just, neurons aren't just part of the brain, it's kind of, they're also maybe in the gut, and actually the whole nervous system is connected, and there's all these different subjective reports of experience continuing even after when we're measuring brain activity coming to a stop. And then other people are like, well, even if you've got correlates of brain activity, that is just a correlate, that doesn't mean that consciousness can just be reduced again to the description you're making of it. Okay, so I could go on and kind of do this kind of bastardized version of the many different views people could take about the phenomenon of consciousness from an academic perspective. And it's relevant and it's interesting, and it kind of comes into the realm of entertainment and intrigue for me. And real intrigue, and it does matter, but that's just one way of looking at it. And maybe I'm just kind of offering that as the most basic of introductions. But if we wanted to maybe deepen this in the context of how you as a being have come to relate to this notion, in that sense, not only as a study of something as if there's you in a sense as a student, and although of course we are students, reading about it in a book or just taking a course and sort of relating to it like an object of study, not to disclude that. I'm curious what the significance of relating to it has been for your being. How about that then? It's nice to welcome you, Cam.
A simple image that comes to mind is just kind of like a fish discovering water. It's a very strange thing to contemplate. Also just considering the way we develop in relation to one another, and our families, we develop as a baby, and we just kind of are quite automatic in the way we do things, and that's necessary because we're very vulnerable when we're young, and we need to develop an ability to survive in relation to our caretakers. And so it's interesting the way we do kind of develop, just kind of come out of this world, whatever, into the situation where we're slowly developing an ability to function and relate. And I think as children, when we get a bit older, we do kind of become quite curious. It's kind of an observation of myself and looking into just the way child's minds work, I guess. There's so much curiosity, there's so much why and what and all this kind of stuff. And the more cynical people might think, well, then the education system ruins people by just conditioning a certain way of functioning, which removes some of the curiosity or the openness or the mystery. And so we can see just how maybe it's natural for us to question what is it that we're experiencing when we relate to ourselves and our environments, and we play and we enjoy all these various different ways of energetically experiencing being in a body. And as we progress in life and we start studying one thing or another, we sort of bring everything into that. And the sciences are a very powerful thing in our society. They've helped protect us, they've helped contain us, they've helped extend life in various ways, making use of that way of understanding the world. They've also constrained us, though, in some ways that may not be the same ways in which people that live in more of an ecological context, like some of the shamanic cultures around the world that use transformative plants, for instance, might experience their world in a very different way. And And they might be kind of pre-linguistic. They might not use words and terms and logic the way we do to sort of create models and build a whole sense of how things work and are contained and constrained and all that. They might actually experience themselves as part of a living ecosystem or field that has its intrinsic kind of a meaning to it, that maybe that creates a lot of mental health balance or a sense of harmony, despite some of the what we might consider primitive elements of associated with that. And so we eventually come to inhabit a kind of identity complex as we develop. And as part of that, with whatever culture we develop in, there's a paradigm, a worldview that is conditioned into us. Tim kind of went through some of those lenses in the context of the way academics think in terms of philosophy of mind and cognitive science. But really, the mystery is what the mystery is, because even when we look at the smallest bits and pieces we can try and study with our instruments, the mystery remains. How did it all begin? Various ways of understanding that are completely dependent on the way in which we use our brains and the kind of things that we experience. And so, in some ways in our culture, we're very much drawn to that which is necessary to survive and live a very orderly life that does protect us from the chaos of nature. But the chaos of nature isn't just hostile in a sense, it's also there's also potential in that sort of chaos, as long as we understand how it might relate to consciousness, I think. A lot of standard thinking might very much be very much tuned into a refined sense of, well, I can touch this table, so it must be real. It's a very present and drawing part of my experience right now. But what if I flicked a switch and I couldn't see a table as separate from the rest of it? Would I even think of it as relevant to touch it? Would I experience that the same way? Would that actually feel like a solid object to me, or would it just feel like some wave passing through my consciousness? And obviously a lot of us get our introduction in some sense to the living mystery of consciousness through dreams. And the stuff that we've experienced in dreams, no doubt every single one of us here, or for the most part, has experienced things that are just beyond language in dreams, or just so bizarre that, how do we even model them in art in some sense when we come back and wake up in some sense? So there is this kind of undulation going on, it seems, and that brings us into this world where we've got objects and we perceive them and we learn to work with them and shape artifacts to create our little corners of the world, our realities, and we talk to one another about all the magical things going on in that situation. But then there's this other place that seems to be more of the nature of the dream world, where there's more kind of fluidity, there's more kind of symbolism and more kind of weird little nuances in which things come together, and we're completely immersed in them and they seem very real, and then we wake up. And with that, I think, is the idea that, what does it mean to actually wake up? Is this just waking up as an individual in a universal system? Is there going to be a day where these bodies perish and our sense of consciousness dissolves into this whole other domain of information, a whole field, universal field of some kind? And are we going to find, therefore, that our identities in these bodies were just transient vehicles to experience consciousness? And, are we going to actually experience this weird sense of artistic play dissolving back into potential, the potential of infinite information fields of some kind? And so hopefully this opens us up in a sense, not simply our imaginations, but also a real sense of understanding that it's not necessarily that there's life and death, but it could be that consciousness is engaged in a process, and it closes up to create organism and then maybe opens back in some dramatic sense in terms of part and whole, as some of the language that Tim often uses from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. There's a lot of fascinating things there, and a lot of people have thought really deeply about these topics and these questions and these ways of understanding for a very long time. And I think that's what unites us across time and culture as well, that we're all kind of present in consciousness. No one can deny that. Philosophers have tried to deny everything else, but we can't deny that. That's the one thing that kind of connects us all in a way that is fundamentally entangled, even when we look at quantum physics. So it's very interesting. And some cultures have gone down different paths than others. We've got kind of Oriental philosophies that are really about being with that sense of fundamental emptiness associated with consciousness, and really being comfortable harmonizing with that in some way. Perhaps not really acknowledging enough of our shadow sides, the real struggles, the stuff that alchemists talk about, that, it's like the caterpillar before it becomes the butterfly, all that weird kind of horrible kind of dark night of the soul stuff that characterizes so many of our lives, really, as a default, because of the constraints that we all experience energetically, economically, relationally, just trying to figure out how to communicate all these kind of things. And so, there has been a lot of merit, I think, from studying in a more discrete way the sciences and trying to figure out personalities and complexes in a way that hasn't been perhaps part of some of the Oriental philosophies that look at just the harmonizing and the transcendence elements of these things, and the non-dual, just experiencing just one flow of consciousness and not so much your identity. But I think the two kind of come hand in hand in a sense, and ultimately might balance out, because, and this is quite a long kind of flow into response to Tim, I'm aware, but there can be just as much of an existential game in forgetting yourself if you're an infinite being, if you're an infinite sense of potentiality. This is one of Alan Watts' arguments. There have been other philosophers as well, but Alan Watts had the idea that if you were simply some kind of a mind or will with infinite capacity, what would you choose to experience? Would you want to get completely lost in the confines of some world in which you're just this limited being? Would that be the trip? Would that be the ultimate thing to experience if you have infinite potential to manifest? And so this whole historical process of relating to the idea of there being potential and that actualizing through evolution, through the infinitude of the universe and the way we relate to it, it's a very interesting topic, and gets back to, I guess, what Tim was saying, that consciousness, if you're kind of constrained in your model or paradigm, or the way you have free energy to think about it from day to day, it might seem a little bit boring, but if you actually pause on that and open up the whole world of possibility that presents itself to the topic of consciousness, it really is kind of all-encompassing, and it does really bring back the enchantment into what it means to be aware in the moment, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. So, in a way, how you finish that is perhaps what I'm hearing most directly as a response to the question, which was something like, what is the significance of consciousness to you as a being in terms of how you have, and the notion of awareness, the recognition that how you are relating to your own awareness is it's a fulcrum around which the whole of your experience is shaped. Now, of course, plenty of things out of my personal direct mediation of influence affect me, but the way in which I respond to those things, there, of course, as is famously argued, therein lies one's freedom. Now, we're talking about degrees of freedom. We are that which is of a living history. We are bound by various constraints. We, yes, can cultivate our awareness. We come into awareness of, at least in part, the nature of what already is, in that sense, what's already constituting us. Cam also brought in the notion of potential, and so we can come into awareness of what potentials may be for us, which is not to say we can access necessarily an omniscient view where we see all possible ends, but certainly the notion of potential here is important, sits in a different place to this recognition of the always already that flows. It's kind of interesting though, of course, because it does very much seem like the nature of flow is to bind in a dynamic continuity, potential and the actual. And so we can think about them as separate categories, and that's helpful, but to actually live it, to actually keep going and breathe it through, and in that sense to cultivate our being in relation to becoming, all of a sudden then we no longer have to think about the differences necessarily. We simply perceive and respond and in discernment until we come up against something that all of a sudden turned out we weren't modeling for so well, and now we don't know what to do about it. And so here might be an interesting place to bring in, and this was part of the invitation for this evening, the relationship between consciousness and unconsciousness. When we come into touch with something that destabilizes our model, we can't anticipate it as well. We might say we were unconscious of that thing, so we can be unconscious or not aware of patterns which are beyond us, at least beyond our proximal form, that influence us. But there's also, of course, famously, as we all know now in the wake of Freud, in the wake of Jung, popular discourse, there is a nature to the human unconscious. The psyche has a nature. Now, I think often, Cam, when we're speaking to each other, how much are we speaking about the human unconscious? How much are we speaking about human consciousness and unconsciousness as a subset of the presentation or realization of psyche? And, can we maybe say things or speculate about the nature of patterns, archetypal patterns, which might include how consciousness and the unconscious show up for human beings, but not necessarily be exclusively bound to the lens of the human psyche. Now, that what I just said there, in a way, I don't know if it's difficult to follow. I do know that some would find it somewhat controversial. I'm sort of opening up here. I'm trying to open up an exploration into the meaning of consciousness and unconsciousness without wanting to burden that with suppositions that are sort of limiting it before we've gone into the discussion. That's a lot of why it takes some time to speak through things in a manner that enables a certain kind of openness, because so much of course, our language and our expectations build in presumptions about, yes, of course, the domains we're speaking about, and we need to specify. But it does seem to me, when it comes to the prospect of being with an unfolding discovery of meaning, in that sense, to participate in understanding, then we want to be careful about the constraints we're bringing in. So now I'm making a meta point of saying, okay, well, we kind of got to bring in constraints. I don't want to constrain it too much, but even this is a constraint, and our time and energy here is a constraint, so you've got to stop somewhere. But nevertheless, the notion of psyche, consciousness, the unconscious, herein as well, we do well to speak about desire. There's that orientation. Could we think about it in terms of, what do I want to say here? I'm trying to look for words to really name with precision how we want to treat the basis of desire, in a sense. It's such a curious one, hey, because in a way, to speak of desire is to speak about what from a Jungian sense might be thought of as the So I'm looking for words here like animating nature of the actual prisms of perception. Do you know what I mean? So it's the reason I'm naming desire is it's like the thing which is framing perception is also motivating an affective relationship to the perception. And so it's not just a, oh, that's what the lens is. It's not just that's what the lens is, because the lens itself has a stake in it being a lens. I apologize for that, but go ahead.
Can you express that quote you came up with about
yeah, I know which one you mean, yeah.
Can you do that? Because I want to just shake that up and move with that a bit.
Yeah, nice. So the quote was, the prisms of our perception set the prisons of our possibility or potential.
Yeah, so that to me brings so much into one or two sentences. And it's something I like to just sit with and soak in. When I read Jung, the person that Tim referenced, when he writes about alchemy, he writes about, if we think about in the absolute sense, and it's kind of metaphysical, obviously, almost religious, the idea that we are all interconnected and that there's something divine about being conscious. He writes about the alchemists and interprets it as what needs redemption in us is this deity that is kind of being imprisoned in us. So we born and we move into a state of constraints when it comes to our consciousness, and without the right initiations, we don't really learn about the depths of what we can actually experience and relate to. And under certain conditions, energetically, we can become very much imprisoned in a world in which we can't really move around much. There aren't too many degrees of freedom. And then we become subject, because we're adaptive and because we have to be adaptive in order to survive anything at all. That's just a fundamental principle with the way we work, biology works. We can get very lost in various prisons, right? And I like the way that idea of a prism and that idea of, just the perception, the way we experience it, can also be conditioned into a sense of being imprisoned. And because we fundamentally exist in a body that operates automatically to help us survive, conserve energy, we can say, we are very much prone to getting stuck. And
let me add in the next line because I remember it from when I wrote it, and I think you'd like to flow with this one as well. So as the prisms of our perception set the prisons of our possibility, but the jailer also has the key.
Yeah, right. That's a tricky riddle, huh? It's a bit of a paradox. And it brings up ideas like, there's one philosopher, there's an idea called known as pre-established harmony, that we can relate to this in different ways, but the idea is, at some point, did something choose to be you? Did it choose to experience you as a variation on life, as a variation on human possibility? Right? And what does that even mean in terms of how could that even be known if that were the case? And so sometimes we can just look back at just the very possibility that variation and novelty is something that consciousness, if it has a potential to manifest from a whole into different parts and organisms, all these things could be desired, sort of ways of playing with what it means to manifest in life, manifest different forms, manifest different forms of consciousness, sensory experience, different prisms. And so necessarily we have the key within ourselves in this way. But gosh, who even gets to realize that, I like this idea of the living mirror theory of consciousness, in which, it's kind of what I've been grabbing at with some of the things I've been saying, but it's the idea that we are all kind of mirrors of this thing that manifests as all of us. but we're mirrors of all the different aspects of that, including the constraining elements. And so it really is sad in some ways, and it causes a lot of grief, just the sense of almost futility that the conditions of life are that difficult for so many organisms, so many people, and they don't really get to manifest much because they're adapting to the worst possible situation, and then they're gone. They're just gone, and they had no choice in that whatsoever. And so a lot of this idea of actually those who are capable of finding the key within themselves and in some sense transcending this idea of the matrix, a lot of that involves what it means to take on a sense of responsibility, to integrate awareness of other possibilities or expanded possibilities, or who knows, back into the limited time we have being human. And so perhaps there's another thing about consciousness that in some part of our minds we're afraid of, because it gives us almost a grandiose sense of responsibility if we were to become more conscious of these unconscious things that kind of are always there to be discovered, but we don't always have the right environmental circumstances to kind of move into them, or a sense of what that might even, if that could even be possible.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to recognize if I just use a simple word, the individual's participation in this within the context of their own subjectivity. To speak about it even more basically, when you might be journaling to yourself or reflecting quietly with yourself, there's no one else around, apart from the many yous. And there is for sure, a capacity we have to cultivate what it is to relate with ourselves. I mean, the thing is that part of what we are relating with when we relate with ourselves is still the conditioning dynamics of society. Freud famously speaking about this. It's not just the id, or in the Jungian sense, in the deep sort of, for Jung you have the sort of the collective unconscious, whereas Jung is more focused on the personal. And so the id being the sort of repository of that which cannot be thought by the subject, that which is not permitted to rise up, so it's kind of sort of repressed down there and not experienced, but is something like the coals burning in the train, moving the whole thing, but you don't want to poke your head in there. If you touch them, you're going to get burned. That's where the fire is. In the Jungian sense, we're talking about a different kind of model there, but nevertheless, there's this underneath, and we can have a relatively more individual relationship to that, depending on the activity we're doing. But of course, even in that sense, how much does individual work interact with a broader field? That's when you might have to start introducing some other metaphysical things. Rather than do that, I actually wanted to get to naming that it seems more, in a way, more accessible. To be honest, the nature of the unconscious itself is something that becomes almost impossible for me to grasp, basically. I don't think I can grasp what it means unless we consider the meaning of relationship. Because there's just simply no knowing of identity without contact with other, without contact with the beyond. Forget about all the living history of the way we're constrained and educated and brought up. It's like, I didn't choose to, did I choose to grow 2 feet? I don't know. Maybe actually at some level there were choices being made that were more like, you know what, we like this form, let's stick with this form. That doesn't look like, so, but that's partly a joke, but also partly there's an edge there of there's genuine questions to ask of the process that is undergoing at so many levels, because we're not, so we're talking about freedom, if we're talking about choice, the degrees of freedom we're talking about, on the one hand, they can be tremendous. I could do the most inappropriate thing you could imagine here and change the course of the evening. And yet, there's so much of me even now which is beholden to the past, beholden to the momentum. I don't have the opportunity to start speaking another language that I don't know, for instance. And so, if we're talking about being constrained and bound, we're talking about prisms, if we're talking about notions like keys, and we said our prisms of perception, well, we are talking about a we. We are talking about a context. And we are talking about, when it comes to the jailer, well, that might be the most misleading thing. I say most misleading, but the most, poetic thing in that quote, because it's certainly not one, although we can recognize in many different contexts there's asymmetries of power and what have you. But I say all of this because I'm linking in now, I want to link in the notion of conscience as part of the invitation to consider the relationship between consciousness and conscience. It would seem to me that the very nature of consciousness and what qualities can actually be experienced are profoundly mediated by conscience, which is in a way another way to speak about the choices we make in the context of ethics, ultimately, in the context of valuation process in consideration of continuity of care and ultimately, in a sense, sort of identity and belonging among all beings, all life, all cosmos. So we're speaking here now, beginning to speak sort of in process relational terms about what it is to participate in interdependence. And so this is why, in a way, to speak about consciousness solely from an academic sense, because in a way, what's being done here, for me, is sort of building up some of the foundations to support what we all already know, which is that we're involved in how we treat each other, and that kind of matters. And we don't really know what we're doing, but we also have to care very sensitively for the patterns of order which make possible our staying together in coherence so we can relate with what we don't know or what challenges us. And in the context of present society, something like consciousness then really becomes, if it's not just in a dream-like mystery of, wow, what happens after we die, as interesting as that is, then it's unbelievably revolutionary, because we're presencing actually that which is not containable, isn't finally nameable, can only be treated with integrity as sacred if we participate in the revealing of it, and in that process, and I'm sure philosophers have spoken about this, probably Heidegger, whatever, in that, maybe not, I don't know, I don't care. In that revealing of it, there is also a veiling of it, right? So we get to have insight, illuminate on the way with each other, but that's also taking place in the context still of a pervasive mystery, in the context still of transformation. We participate in the transformation of understanding, not to come to a final resting point where we understand exactly with finality absolutely everything. That is death by obliterating. There's actually no care in it, in a way, because in a way that kind of knowing, it's not possible for a being to experience. Well, it depends what we mean, but that kind of knowing is just a kind of an obliteration of infinity that makes no distinction with respect to what's more important or what. Anyway, that's a particularly mystical image, and you could probably relate to it in several ways. So I'm going to pause there and just bring it back to the relationship between consciousness and conscience. And I'm curious what you're sort of hearing and what I'm beginning to bring in as some themes here.
It's interesting how countries like this and cultures in industrial nations and cities, often they think of things like conscience in terms of what can be argued. It's very much involves the mind and boundaries. It's a very masculine, it's in a sense a very masculine approach to understanding what conscience could be if we look at actions and what is the right kind of actions to take with whatever considerations we bring into that. I can see the downside to that, though, as someone who practices the yoga traditions, various forms of transforming the body. It seems like, to some degree, the Oriental philosophies look at first how to actually bring the body into a state of health and harmony, and that conditions the right kind of emotional states and balance inside. And so we don't necessarily need to write out logic and arguments or be in adversarial court battles of some kind, because we actually feel pretty damn good inside because of these practices. And that brings us into a harmonious state where we're less prone to playing games that are kind of like zero-sum games.
And projections as well, in principle.
Projections.
There's this type of projection to mediate.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in other words, I guess Western countries have kind of caught up in some ways, and somewhat through the sciences as well, just how important the body is and understanding the body is and the health of the body for what it means to be in a state of consciousness from which conscience, I think, unfolds naturally. When you feel amazing inside, you want everyone to feel amazing inside, right? It's a contagious thing, and often people that feel terrible sometimes feel threatened by seeing other people not looking like they feel terrible. And I think part of that is the parts of ourselves that want a sense of a caring world to come and visit them, and not everyone has the opportunity for that to happen. And so the defenses can lead to a sense of resentment sometimes. And so that there is a bit of a cost through coming out of holistic ways of living, I think, which are in some sense more simple. It's not necessarily that we will use 10 different types of digital tech to achieve what we need to achieve during the day. Maybe we just kind of gather, do some breathing practices and some yoga perhaps, and then we kind of meet and then we talk about something, maybe kind of like this, right? And so, just that distinction between what it means to just make all these assumptions about the thing that is ultimately doing the conscience, the idea of what a conscience is and what is right or wrong, and actually focusing on the fundamentals of what conditions the natural unfoldment of what is more harmonious in terms of the way we communicate and the way we make decisions, and the way that kind of leads to a continuity of our experience in culture.
So, what I'm sort of feeling is that bringing the notion of mystery into the space, because I think that might be helpful to ground a little bit of why this gathering's even taking place, and how our gathering here, at least from my perspective, is, or at least I hope it to be, in service to honoring the mystery and cultivating the understanding and relationship that can continue to honor the mystery. Now, there's a lot I'm building into that. Certainly, I also mean honor life and honor a number of things, not exclusively so. But I think that it would be a mistake not to open up the meaning, the question, very much the question of what is a mystery school? It's often the kind of thing that's named in the context of Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries, popularly spoken about. They were a long-running, many-century-long, whether they were initiation ceremonies, rites of passage, they also seem to serve a social function as a place of return, although most people, from my understanding, only attended once, if they had the opportunity at all. We're talking about here, I could be off by a few hundred years in either direction, but maybe looking at something like 700 BC up into probably getting totally destroyed by a couple hundred AD. So the history that I've read goes by the Christians wanting to stamp out what would be seen as whether pagan ritual or previous instantiations of what became the deity of Christ, the myth and the living myth of Christ. It's argued, at least by some, that Brian Muarescu makes the case for this, that Dionysus and the figure of Dionysus as worshipped in different ways around the Mediterranean over this period of time was a precursor myth, living myth and symbol to Christ in a number of ways. Not to reduce Christ to that at all, but nevertheless you could see why from that perspective, why there might have been a desire to stamp out remnants of traditions that were using sacrament to engender experiences which were gathering and creating profound context for belonging in a way that bound people together in a deep sense of connection to each other, but also homing in the cosmos. And so in that sense, when we're speaking about the context of a mystery school, we would seem to be speaking about the kind of context that can support people into deepening connection with themselves, each other, and the world. That's quite a basic way of putting it. But what do we mean by, for sure, all of those three categories is very, very interesting. We're for sure speaking about interpretation as well as direct experience. And that's when, of course, it becomes very interesting, because one can have a direct experience of, you see, as soon as I go of and I start to name it, I'm now engaging almost by definition in a kind of interpretation of that which I am expressing here as effectively being the experience which is, on the one hand, you could think about it as the breaker of chains, a breaking of chains, as the transcendent, as the kind of ending of the trance. But even that brings in metaphor, and even that itself is poetry, because it would seem to me that the nature of such experience can also include in it profound acceptance. And Cam's speaking about harmony. There is, and not needing to grasp for logic to make sense of whatever it is. In principle, part of the nature of such experience, not only like a mysterium tremendum of something overwhelming and all powerful, and in the sense of greater than a wave just breaking through your barriers and previous sense of how things worked, that would seem to me to be a phase in a process, and one that you can get trapped in and just bang into again on repetition in a very painful and devastating way. But in the context then of maybe surfing that wave, in the context of accepting some of that energy and being borne along by it, that then starts to become, okay, well, the world is, and the nature of experience is so much more and beyond what I ever thought it was, but I still am in a context that's helping me to regulate and trust my being. I'm still able to breathe. There are qualities here where, in effect, it's sort of permitted and it's accepted to undergo the overcoming of experience and undergo the mystery and the journey with how consciousness can present itself. So yeah, that as some context, it's radical to speak about in many ways, despite the fact that, as far as I can tell, I'm actually just trying to name what is ultimately would seem to me, to the degree that a human culture bars the participation in understanding this, then we're barring a birthright relation to our own dignity and how that actually relates in the context of being with integrity. Which isn't to say I'm saying everybody should just blindly, if anybody has followed this work and knows where we're coming from in relation to this context for supporting and mediating and strengthening capacity and to select whether or not in fact one wants to undergo such experiences is a totally different part of the conversation. It's absolutely necessary and not putting the cart before the horse, but from the perspective of an exploration in the context of consciousness and opening perception and relating to what's here and just saying, hang on, what is the there? Is there a there? Can we at least open up to the reality that there's more than just what's rammed down our throats as we're scrolling down absolute bullshit representing the breakdown of capacity to stay with a deepening of connection to real significance and meaning in life, and just like, oh, there was something significant. Let me like carve that off. And what's the word when you hack like engagement? You kind of like trying to hack engagement from the mystery, basically, rather than, it's like there's so much more there. And these are the types of things we must be open to, I think, if we're to take on the question of what it is to seek a basis from which we can know and communicate and sort of recognize that we are not the center of the universe, and that and that we need each other and to respect each other in order to actually relate with the qualities of what life can be all about. Say what life is all about, but life can be all about,
And on that note, so a lot of that looks at the experience of time as a quantity, right? We're kind of, it's almost like a tyrant for some of us sometimes, just the way we experience the demands of time and trying to catch up and all these demands on our systems from being in time. We can experience states of consciousness that transcend space-time. And that's a whole other kind of thing to do under special circumstances, no doubt, because the reality is in order to sustain ourselves economically, we need to be in time in some sense. Symbols and language and communication requires an orientation towards objects and time. All that kind of a thing is demanded of us. But when we do have the opportunity and the cultures that have the right kind of setup for this, for the experience of time as more of the moment, the qualitative aspect of time, and we can really feel into that, again, kind of bring in that idea of that we can experience harmonious things within ourselves and ecstasies and all kinds of things. When I think of consciousness and I think of the way philosophers sometimes butcher it into this game of logic, I'm just so uninspired by that. I'm so turned off by that because it does not spark the energy in me that these mystery schools in the past had unleashed, right? We might understand through some of the reports and from what we understand can happen in shamanic spaces, for instance. When I put side by side my experiences in a philosophy department or, studying the brain in a psychology department or whatever, with my experiences in a shamanic transformative space in which things are happening so rapidly that I could never have anticipated sticking in my mind and writing out logic. They're happening so transformatively quickly, and the sense of who I am is dying just so effortlessly, and yet my body is okay. My body is still, heart still beating, lungs still breathing, all that kind of a thing. All of a sudden, I'm in a space of mythological, qualitative presence with myself and with this whole process that seems to go in and out of these bodies that we call life and death. And so a lot of what I'm actually talking about here is more of the feminine. It's like in the Vedic tradition, you know, the sacred feminine, you know, that the feeling aspect and that being amplified and enriched as it flows through the body has a kind of ecstasis, like creative element to it. And when we lose that, talking about consciousness, we're losing half the essence of life, I think, because, or maybe the most powerful or sacred essence of life, you know. And I think what we need to do if we want to really re-enchant our way of relating to consciousness and each other as we communicate in relation to the people entangled in consciousness and participation with each other, is to reignite the sense of there being that sacred mirror aspect of our presence with one another, and that can even be opened up, and that we can really become confronted by more degrees of that feeling of the sacred within ourselves, and then honor each human being accordingly. You know, this is, it might sound like a almost romantic way of thinking about the process of being a human being and relating to ideas and things like consciousness, but it's actually part of the essence of what I think stabilizes societies. I don't think you can have a very stable society if it's dry, if a conversation about consciousness is dry, is purely about, you know, referring to brains and neurotransmitters, or, you know, really rigid ideas that don't spark the energy within ourselves. So we need that balance, I think, and we need to bring more of that sense of we're part of a process, we're conscious within it. It's sometimes thought of as a nested idea, that we're nested within a greater consciousness and a greater consciousness. We discover that maybe through initiations throughout history. To mention the mystery of Eleusis is one from the Greek tradition, but they've been happening all over the world, we might say, or a lot of shamanic cultures, and discovering plant medicines or plant fungi that can inspire this opening up of our constraining mechanisms. And again, with that, we can feel more into what is available to us in the right ecological situation. And hopefully that does inspire us to actually re-empower a sense of the magic in life as we communicate with one another, because it's always there. I mean, you know, every single one of you right now is actually creating what's going on here, your active participations, and you don't even have to talk to do that. It's just, it's ever present in the space. And I think a lot of what's going on here and what we're bringing together is just the way, that's what Voicecraft is about. It's about you're actually creating the space through your participation. And even, you know, with Tim's introduction to the silence earlier, the silence itself is another way of creating the energy of the space in a powerful way.
Yeah, thank you, Cam. So that felt like the right kind of bridge to actually open up to questions and comments and participation more broadly. Yes, go ahead, Les. And as well, because you're facing us and others are behind you, we'll have to take that into account as well. I don't know how much everybody's going to... Yeah.
A lot of us would have heard what Rowan said.